And we're back. So for those of you who are wondering what happened, we did stream actually, it created a new stream instead of streaming to the link. So you can see the first 4 minutes of the show in a different stream. I'll merge them and probably upload this later. But rather than have Titan, who was really good about sending out links everywhere, rather than have him send out a new link, I just killed the old one. So the first 5 minutes of the show is actually somewhere else. Like I said, we can merge it and get that fixed. But we were talking about, so thank you very much for that correction. So we hadn't covered all that much. We covered the record snowfall in 4 days, breaking the record for, not the record, but the average yearly snowfall. So that was an interesting one. And now we are on to COVID. And the biggies that I had just talked about was that Florida, which had the last year had fueled by Delta, had a record of 26,000 daily infections, now has 76,000. And Texas Governor Greg Abbott I didn't even have to say Texas. I didn't have to say Greg Abbott. If I said that there was a state that was going to be that was going to win the award for the most hypocritical state in human history, you'd have known I was talking about Texas. And they are now asking Biden and FEMA for support in fighting the wave of Omicron, which is overcoming their state in large part because they have been doing absolutely everything to help it. With me today is student Dr. Ben and Homozygote. So let's continue. Again, I do apologize for the wrong channel on that. And so where do we stand? What do we now? I have a whole bunch of questions that I do want to ask, but what is the state of infections right now, and what are we looking at? I'll start with Homozygote, since that's your specialty.
Yeah, well, I'd say generally speaking, things are not good. I think we allegedly broke the records for most cases in a day ever of any country around the world with over 1 million. I think it was 1,017,000 and change. I don't know how much of that is due to testing backlogs, but I could probably confidently assert at the rate Omicron is spreading, that's probably an undercount. Testing capacity is pretty much saturated everywhere. Rapid tests are not widely available in most places. The government's been very slow to make rapid tests available for everybody. And even if people solely use a rapid test, if they come back positive, they're not necessarily going to tell anybody outside of their close circles and employer and coworkers, stuff like that. Government officials might not know. So all of that to say, Omicron is basically a flattened curve pointing vertically with no signs right now in the U.S. of slowing down. Globally, kind of depends on your country of reference. The trends are different depending on what country you're talking about. We were just talking on my stream a little bit about how in London things tend to be on the downswing right now because Omicron seems to have burnt through a lot of the folks there already. But it's certainly still not out of they're not out of the woods yet. And we are just, I think, making our first foray into the woods here in the U.S.
Well, now you had said earlier, too, that one of the things that we really needed was to have some kind of central database as to who's getting tested and what the results are. And obviously confidentiality is important. But otherwise, we don't know what the numbers are, and we don't know who's testing positive. And it's all sort of self-reporting, and there's also no way to verify if we end up doing anything like a vaccine passport. If there's no national system, there's no way to stay on it. So is that still something that you're interested in?
Yeah. I mean, I would love to see some sort of tracking database, whether it's at a municipal level, a state level, a federal level. It would be really nice if on the smaller localities, on the local and state level, they had the funding required to establish and maintain those systems. So that way they would have a better idea of spread and what the situation even on the ground looks like with respect to test positivity and what's going on in their communities. With respect to vaccination status, absolutely. I think that should be mandatory for every state, or ideally a centralized federal system that could keep track of this. Again, I think it was sometime 2020, the U.S. government contracted out to a company called Deloitte, I think a consulting firm, to make said system, which was so glitchy and non-functional, every single state abandoned it. So we kind of have this very patchy framework that is mostly non-functional in terms of trying to keep track. I think this is manifested in even the CDC having some difficulty with Omicron, assessing just how much of all COVID in the US right now actually belongs to Omicron. I think they, for the week ending in December 18th, recently they changed the numbers from like 75% of all cases were Omicron to 22.5% because their testing and surveillance was not where it needed to be. So I think just really across the board, we're more in the dark than we ever should have been with respect to what the hell is going on around us.
Yeah. I guess if you wanted to say anything before I launched into my bit about Omicron.
Well, I want to go into the CDC. I definitely want to come back to Omicron as well. But since we actually just brought up the CDC just a couple of hours ago said that Omicron is 3 times more infectious than the previous. And there is now another one in France that I'd like to talk about, a new variant that seems to be concerning some people. So I'd like to talk about that. But since we're on the CDC right now, let's quickly talk about the CDC. Well, quickly. I think we're going to get stuck here for a few minutes because I think we have some issues. Now, I know Homozygote, you have in the past been very critical of the CDC, especially when this started, and it had been very politicized. As I understand it, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Your opinion did improve a bit, but nonetheless, we now have a situation where they have made recommendations that they admit aren't scientifically necessarily the best recommendations, depending on how you choose to I mean, it gets a little crazy because what they're saying is, well, these are the best recommendations, assuming that you understand what people are actually willing to do and what people are concerned about economically. And once you've factored all of that stuff in, then these are the best recommendations that they can make. And I don't know if that's necessarily their job to be factoring that in. I don't know that that's what the CDC is supposed to be doing. I don't know if they're supposed to be making recommendations directly to the American public, or is the administration supposed to be? So what on earth are we? What are their late? Okay, someone tell me what their latest guidelines are and what we're looking at for this organization.
Sorry, go ahead, Ben.
Oh, I mean, because I can talk a whole lot about the healthcare side of it, because this is really dangerous. Specifically, the recommendation that I'm really worried about is the isolation for 5 days before being able to go back to work. And that doesn't seem like such a big deal for many people. But we know that people are still likely infectious after 5 days. So you're not controlling the spread there. But then think about the people who they're sending back after those 5 days. It's people who work in hospitals, people who are around immunocompromised people, who have been carrying all of us on their backs for the entirety of the pandemic. They're still working incredibly hard. They are carrying the majority of this burden. And yet the CDC and other organizations are saying, suck it up. You're going to go back to work after 5 days. We don't care that you've been trudging through this for years now. We don't care that you are the experts on this and that you know this is not a good idea. We're going to send you back to the hellhole of a hospital that you are already in and have you transmit to people who are vulnerable. That is, no matter what you think about the economy, that is downright irresponsible and also very disrespectful to all of the people that have been busting their asses this entire time.
Now, aren't these recommendations, though, specifically for non-symptomatic or asymptomatic people, the 5-day wait period? I thought it was still 10 days if you were symptomatic.
Yeah, so it's a clusterfuck. That's the best way I can put it. Generally speaking, when the CDC made that recommendation, what they posted on their own website was contradictory with respect to symptomatology and whether or not you could leave quarantine. At first, they said if you were asymptomatic, but then it said, or if your symptoms are resolving, unless you have a fever, then maybe you should stay a little longer. We don't know. That was basically what the initial CDC guideline amounted to. Generally speaking, a sane version of this policy, this is kind of what I use as an argument to really delineate how insane the CDC is with this particular guideline. In the UK, they have a test to leave quarantine early policy where if you take a rapid test and you test negative, you do that 2 days straight. on day 5 and 6, then you can leave quarantine on day 7, right? A negative rapid test would indicate that you do not have actively replicating virus, and therefore you are way less likely to transmit to somebody else, and you can go back to work or whatever you've been doing. The ire that the CDC rightfully got as a consequence of this guideline is they eliminated entirely the testing requirement. So they basically said, you, the sick person, it's up to you on the honor system. If you think maybe pinky promise that your symptoms are resolving, or that you think you might be asymptomatic if you just feel like you are that day, then you can leave because the economy demands you and your labor. That's, I think, the difference between a sane and an insane version of a testing to leave quarantine policy versus just a really lackluster quarantine policy. And I think, as Ben mentioned, I think as you mentioned, Nick, like, this was literally by their own admission solely to repopulate the workforces. This wasn't an idea that is scientifically justified. You can literally look at a progression of rapid testing on people who are sick. They don't test negative on a rapid test sometimes until 10 days into their infection. Like, this is a thing with Omicron. This has been also demonstrated with Delta, I think, as well. So it's just about insane no matter what angle you approach it from.
So,
although even
please.
Even thinking about the rapid test too, like, even relying on the rapid test is risky enough as it is, considering they have a low sensitivity and a high specificity. So you're already risking people having false negatives, and then now you're just saying, oh, well, we're beyond that. Even we're just going to not have any tests. Like, even a low sensitivity test is better than no test. Like, it's not perfect. Like, it's still a compromise, but abandoning the test altogether is just.
So now we're compromising on the compromise on the compromise is essentially.
Yeah. Oh, here, let me add one more compromise to that. The FDA has also come out and said, due to the mutations in the Omicron nucleocapsid protein, that rapid testing has even less sensitivity than before. So.
Okay.
Rapid tests are even less useful when it comes to false negatives from a genuine positive in that sort of circumstance. On top of that, in the UK, which is standard practice, they tell people, because the tests really explain this in their instructions when you get the physical test, to swab your throat and then your nose and then apply your sample to the card. In the US, because the tests are not quote unquote FDA approved to do that, the CDC is saying don't do that. But when people are doing that as they're symptomatic, they pick up a second rapid test, do it side by side, but with swabbing their throat this time. The one where they swab their throat and their nose comes back positive. The chest nose swab comes back negative. Mm-hmm. So they might not necessarily even be sampling the right areas either. So this is an entire mess when it comes to rapid testing.
And you're using up twice the number of tests. Is that?
Possibly, if you're needing to, do a comparison, if you're trying to run that experiment, you yourself, you're using 2 rapid tests. Ideally, people would just swab their throat and then their nose the first time. So anybody who's happening to be listening right now, if you need to rapid test, do that. It doesn't matter whether it's FDA approved or not. Just do it. It's standard practice in the UK.
So what about false negatives? Does that pop up a lot?
Not as much, because it's a highly specific test. It's not a highly sensitive test. I have videos on my channel explaining sensitivity and specificity and what those mean. But each of those kind of correlates to a likelihood of a false negative or a likelihood of a false positive. So if you have a test that's very highly specific, you're basically you're targeting a smaller group of people. Essentially, you're picking up a smaller group of people. So it's more likely that small group is not going to be a false negative. On the flip side, with sensitivity, you're picking up an entire huge group of people to rule them in. But at the same time, you're having some risks on the flip side of that. So it's a complicated thing to try to explain. Homozygote probably can explain it in better words.
Yeah, I think you pretty much got it. Like, if with respect to false negatives, if you have a low sensitivity test, you might get false negatives. With respect to false positives with a rapid test, they're almost non-existent because it's such a highly specific test that there's no way it's picking up anything else practically except for virus protein.
Yep.
Okay, that was my question. about false positives, which if you get a test and it comes back positive, it's pretty likely that you do have COVID. I just want to make sure
close to 100%. Very close to 100%.
I just want to make sure I'm not isolating myself in my truck for absolutely no reason.
Isolating yourself in your truck, you spend 99% of your just like days awake, asleep. It doesn't matter, in a 6x6 cabin, which I've been in. Actually, it's not that bad. It's well, no, I've seen it. I hung out in it, so I was impressed. But I'm like, how are you going to isolate further than that? What what the hell are you?
It does mean wander into the truck stop whenever I want to. I mean, come on.
Oh, you're trapped. You're trapped by record, breaking snow after 4 days.
Yeah, everything's shut down anyway. Not like I could go in and spread joy around anyway. But
I want to know how you got it in the first place. But that's a story for another time. I was like, did the truck give it to you? Did it? Okay, so all right, so. Okay, I had a question about this. Okay, so first of all, we just dropped the link to Student Dr. Ben's channel, so you can find his the videos that he was describing there. We also have a link to Homozygotes. We've dropped them in. We'll make sure they're also going to be in the description, so you can find those. So now the CDC has said that, well, the reason we're doing this is because we're trying to actually. No, before I even get back to that, I want to hit the numbers. So there's an argument that the mortality rate on this is so low. It's lower really even than the flu. So we are spending all this time and effort over something that if you get it probably isn't going to kill you. So what's the problem?
Yeah, so again, I think this goes back to something I've said before. I think the past couple of times I've been on here. People really need to look past the simple do you die or not, black and white binary. There's a lot of stuff in between. There's long COVID, which is still very poorly understood, and I think going to be very poorly understood for months and even years to come after this. And I would also say, just in the spirit of preventing yourself from suffering at the hands of something that, even if it's quote unquote mild, that's simply a clinical distinction, meaning like not hospitalized. That doesn't mean it's going to be, sunshine and rainbows and puppy dog kisses. You still could be having all sorts of awful symptoms. You could feel like shit. You might have brain fog. You might have all the respiratory involvement. There's so much variability with this too, that it's not really something you want to chance, even if it's not putting people in the ICU and killing them at as high of a rate as something like Delta. One, that doesn't mean that it's, an attenuated, harmless version of the virus that works as nature's vaccine. That's absolutely not how it works, and that's not how it's ever going to work. So I would, again, really encourage people who think that we should just, let it rip, get it over with, and go back to normal. You are not thinking of a lot of the other ramifications that could affect your quality of life, right? Your ability to go to work, to spend time with the people you love and you care about. All of that could be impacted from having a particularly nasty case of COVID, even if you didn't die.
Well, and I want to mention, I want to mention too that the ICU definition of mild is that you are not critical. So if you're listening to an intensivist say that you have a mild case, that means you're probably not in the ICU and you're not in an event and you're not on pressors. You're not like in critical condition. So our colloquial use of mild is not the same as the medical use of mild, just as Homozygote said. And there are plenty of additional problems that you can get from COVID, even thinking beyond the things that we already know, like blood clots, like ARDS, thinking about just sequelae of a viral infection in general. Omicron is presenting more like an upper respiratory infection, and a lot of people are feeling more like cold type symptoms, like common cold symptoms. But one thing that like really ends up killing people is not the viral infection itself in like URIs. It's secondary bacterial infections that you get after, like causing other types of pneumonias, any opportunistic infections that you might not get if you were normally immunocompetent. So it's, even if COVID itself isn't the problem, there are plenty of other reasons to worry. And again, you don't know if you're high risk or not a lot of the time. So something like it's still killing children, still killing people who are who don't have comorbidities, and you just don't know if that's going to be you or not. You don't know if it's going to be someone you love or not.
I'm going to go back a step just because, and then I want to hear his answering, and then I got my next question, but I just want to go back a step because we did have a concern, and since we're getting further and further from the original question, I just want to ask and then come right back to where we are. But we did have a concern. So are you guys sure? So is it like if somebody has got like a really bad flu, bad cold, or sinus congestion, does that increase the chances that they're going to get a false positive on that test?
Which test? The rapid test?
The rapid test, yes.
No, so the rapid test is very specific to a particular protein from SARS-CoV-2. So if somebody happens to have the common cold or the flu, these tests are specific in such a way that they do not cross-react with other proteins from other germs very well.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Xandring, what was your question?
Oh, I guess I was going to point out when it comes to the CDC that it seems like they're flipping around. To me, they've lost quite a lot of credibility. They seem to have become political, and I don't personally believe that the CDC should ever have been political. I personally think that it's the people who set policy that are supposed to take in all of the factors involved and come up with a policy. Taking into account all of the things involved. Not the medical side of it, the economic side of it, the personal behavior side of it. It's the policymakers that should be bringing all of that together and coming up with a comprehensive policy to follow, whereas the CDC should be specifically about, look, this is an infectious disease. These are the things that you would need to do to, scientifically to stop a pandemic from spreading, and give these recommendations to the administration. The administration would take these recommendations with all the recommendations from all the other experts in the fields and come together with a comprehensive. It seems like we have a mess, and that's not really what's happening. It seems the CDC has become quite political about the issue as well, and has lost quite a bit of credibility because of it. What do you think the actual CDC's role should be? Should it be strictly science and just giving the recommendations based off of a pandemic control or a scientific approach to it and disregarding any other aspect? Or should it be looking at other potential areas outside of just infectious disease control?
Well, fundamentally, I would say that, I get this sort of sentiment a lot. I hear it from all sorts of folks that, science isn't political, or that the CDC should really just sort of exist in this very siloed sense of only looking at, the biology of a virus and measures to implement to try and control it. And I would kind of like to counter that by saying, science has always been political. Even the research that people do in laboratories is a consequence of political decision making, right? The CDC's budget is a function of government spending. So the fact that it even exists as an agency and has money and people to do stuff is a political consequence. And I think with respect to the Delta CEO issue and the CDC quarantine guideline, I think that's a very strong indicator that there are always going to be political pressures on an institution such as the CDC. And I think the question should be whether they should internalize that and make decisions based off of that, or assert the role of the science over the political whims of corporations, CEOs, and other entities that might be short-staffed looking for a shortcut to repopulate their workforces. I would say the CDC, ideally, in a perfect world, should defend the science, and they should actually make policy that is based off of data. But at the same time, they need to be fundamentally resistant to partisan political pressures to do policy, to create policy like the current quarantine guideline that we have, which you could argue was one at the behest of a corporate entity or multiple corporate entities, and two, designed to try and put the economy on track for a better midterm election outcome. I think there are a lot of people within science that feel like this is a more politically mediated decision than most. So I would say there's a difference between, the fundamentally political nature of the institution and partisan political pressure being applied from the outside. And I would think they need to be resistant from outside pressure while still acknowledging that there are political maneuvers and strategy that they have to engage in if they want to successfully control the disease.
Ben, any thoughts?
I co-sign all that. I don't have a whole lot to add.
Perfect. All right. So now you had mentioned long haul earlier. So we were talking about. So there are two things that I did want to bring up too, which is so It's of course not just the mortality rate. So let's just say it's 1%, and there's arguing over that figure. But let's say 1% of all the people who get COVID die from it. First of all, and we can break this down in any order you like, but I'd like to start. I was thinking maybe starting with long haul, but certainly maybe a couple of other things too. First of all, I've heard, I don't know if this is accurate or not, that there is some indication that if you get it again and or again, that each time you may be getting permanent damage that could accumulate. So that's the first thing that's not being accounted for. And by the way, we have a special guest. We had Nate the lawyer, who's a friend, and I didn't get a chance to say hi while he was here, but we also just had Dr. 𝐍𝐢𝐜𝐡𝐨, who has come on many times to help explain COVID to us in the past, and it's very nice to have you in the audience, Dr. 𝐍𝐢𝐜𝐡𝐨. Thank you for joining us. So, first of all, is there a damage that accumulates over time if you continue getting this? Second of all, long haul, as I understand it, we're learning more and more that as many as 30% of the COVID cases may be getting some form of a long haul that continues, and we don't know how long it is, and we don't know the permanent effects, but it may be for all we know. And then, of course, the strain on the system. If you have a heart attack and you need to get into an ER, but there's a 12-hour waiting list or waiting time just to get in, there's an additional problem there that isn't being calculated when we calculate your 1% chance of. And if everybody else is getting COVID, even if I'm not getting COVID, if everyone else gets COVID, and now I have to wait 12 hours in an emergency situation to get looked at, it seems to me that if I end up dying as a result of that, I essentially am. I didn't die from the disease, but I did die from our inability to manage it properly. So if we could start at least with long haul and or is there damage that is permanent in some cases? Do we know anything about that? And or if you get it multiple times, that you can, in some cases, get more damage accruing?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ben.
I mean, this sounds like a great time to talk about ARDS and kind of long-term effects of it. And ARDS is going to be your more severe cases of COVID, especially pulmonary COVID. Omicron's a bit different because we're not seeing a lot of penetration of the lungs in Omicron. But with ARDS, you're damaging your lung tissue, and then your immune response is overkill to the point where you are doing more damage with your immune system. So this is kind of funny when people say that, oh, our immune systems are just going to handle it. No, your immune system is going to fuck with you. Like, it does that. Your immune system does not always do a good job, and a lot of times it can do a significant amount of damage. So you're getting damage to your lungs already. You're getting more damage from your immune system, and then over time it's going to scar. You're going to get fibrosis, and you really can't reverse fibrosis. So if you get lung damage multiple times and you just keep adding more fibrosis, like scar tissue, there's not a whole lot you can do, and you're going to get a restrictive lung disease. And that's, of course, a very severe case. Certain issues along with long COVID, things like fatigue, chronic cough, all that kind of stuff might not always be tied to fibrosis and ARDS, but that's just kind of the easiest example to go to of why you'd get damage over time and why it would be permanent damage.
Yeah, so I think, again, I would totally agree with everything you just said. I think when it comes to damage, there are some indicators that it's not just the physical tissues that COVID has access to, and as you described with ARDS and the immune system overreaction localized to the lungs with the development of pulmonary fibrosis. And any tissue, in theory, could have some sort of damage caused to it. And given that this is a primarily respiratory illness, you look at lungs and respiratory airways as sort of the first sites. Again, you can have, and this has overlap with long COVID, you could have damage to the kidney tissue, for example. That's another very ACE2 rich part of the body that the virus can get to. There's there was actually recently a Cell publication that talked about how, at least in a laboratory study where they just have kidney cells and they infect them with the virus, it has a lot of the same pathological manifestations of damage in the kidney as it does in the lung. So I think it would stand to reason that if the virus has unbridled access to any tissue, it will damage it, and the immune system is probably not going to help. I will also say the immune system itself, there is some increasing evidence to suggest that at least some part of the immune system, I think T cells specifically that I've seen recently, can get what is basically called exhausted. And I think it means exactly how it sounds, how we would say, I'm exhausted after a long day at work. The immune system can get sort of tired and burnt out after fighting an illness, especially if it's fighting it repeatedly over and over again. And it may not necessarily regain its capacity to fight said illness with multiple encounters with this particular virus as it would for other viruses in general. There seems to be some aspect of this virus's biology that seems to be really hard on the immune system. So I would say, based on all of that, this is not a chance that I would take even once, let alone multiple times. And I would hate to see any microscopic or even clinically presenting damage in people who have gotten reinfections. I've seen conflicting reports that reinfections are more severe on average, other times less severe, but I think that spans multiple variants, different people. I think there's too many confounding factors to really have a super clear picture of what reinfection risk is like, but I think there's so many variables that all point towards bad that I don't want to take the chance.
And something else I do want to jump on with that specifically really quick. And this is speculation. So this is not something that is confirmed at this point, but it is something that we see with other diseases, something called molecular mimicry. So if you get infected with something, your immune cells might, if you have an antigen in your body and you have similar presentations on healthy cells, you can get autoimmunity. And it's not something that we're seeing currently with COVID, but it's something that you see with like streptococcus and certain other infections, like MS is caused by molecular mimicry. So there I think implications down the road that we could potentially run into with repeat infections that we just don't know about yet because the timing hasn't been in place yet to really see it happen. But no matter what, we shouldn't be taking reinfections so lightly, and I think Homozygote really did explain it very well in that.
Now, I've heard that in the many differences between Delta and Omicron, Omicron doesn't spread inside your lungs as rapidly as Delta. Is it true that because of that, Omicron causes less lung damage?
It might be too early to say. I mean, based off of some of the early mechanistic studies with respect to Omicron, its method of entry into cells is different. I think as a consequence of that, it's what's called a cell tropism, or the type of cell it likes to infect in the respiratory tract. That has changed. It has a bigger preference for nasal epithelial cells, or basically cells that line your upper respiratory tract. So in a lot of the mouse models, and even in some of the clinical numbers when it comes to ICU capacity and death at the early part of this Omicron surge globally, the ICU and death numbers are looking better, and all of the mouse studies seem to suggest it can spare the lungs more readily than other variants before it, but that isn't necessarily sort of a criteria of exclusion. It could still mess up your lungs. It's not going to do it because people saw in some mouse models that it did it less. It still has the capacity to do it. It's just the dynamics of how the infection sets up shop and navigates the airways as your body starts producing virus in the very early stages. That's different. So there's going to be all sorts of variability between the individual, the viral load, Omicron's dynamics with cell entry and cell type infection. I think generally speaking, we can say it's going to spare the lungs more often on a case-by-case basis. I think that's really the most we could say based on what I know.
Well, and if it really is 3 times as infectious, and if any of that damage ends up being permanent, even if it's less damage, if it's permanent and you continually get reinfected because it's so common, it seems to me that cumulatively you'd end up with a much bigger problem and maybe would prefer Delta. I mean, it's possible. No way to really know at this point, but reinfection, I don't think, is ever going to be a good thing. Let me put it that way. So now I've also heard this. I've heard the suggestion that we are now in the stages of where this is going to become endemic, and that what we should be expecting is that it's going to it's going to reach a point where it's going to infect everybody, which was a kind of a given anyway, and that we were just going to flatten the curve is sort of the best we could sort of hope for. And so, and then people will have their own natural immunity to it. We'll still need some people to get vaccines, and we'll still need boosters, but it's going to be a yearly thing, and everyone's just going to go back to life the way it was, and that this is, in fact, the variant that's going to happen with, because it is A, so transmissible, and B, so much less lethal than the Delta.
Yeah, so I would argue against that immediately. I mean, there's already evidence pre-Omicron that somewhere between a quarter to a third, I mean, we can maybe even lower the lower bound to like 20%, but let's use the most conservative estimate here. There's evidence to suggest that about 20% of people who ever encounter COVID don't seroconvert, meaning that they do not even make antibodies in the first place to give them any protection against future virus infection. So as a function of that, even pre-Omicron, there are still going to be people whose protection is insufficient after they test positive and then test negative because they quote unquote got over it. That doesn't necessarily mean that their full adaptive immune response has formed to give them the best protection their body is capable of giving them. I will also say, both in terms of vaccinated people and in terms of people who got infected the hard way and actually did make antibodies and T cells to fight off the virus, antibody-specific immunity, regardless of source, it wanes over time. With coronaviruses in general, the waning time is about 3 to 4 months. So antibodies in people's systems are going to naturally go down. That's just a function of how the immune system works. That's why we're currently boosting people right now with a third vaccine to give them more antibodies than they ever had before to fight off things like Omicron. So we're kind of, I think, setting up our society with that mindset of, oh, it's endemic. This is nature's vaccine. Let's just let it burn through everybody, and then we're back to normal. We're setting ourselves up for this boom and bust, like American economy type series of surges and then troughs in the case counts. Like, we'll get past this Omicron surge, cases might go down in the spring, and then it might go back up again once everybody's immunity has worn off. Rinse and repeat over and over and over again until virus transmission has been cut off eventually at some point. I would say also endemicity is simply a function of how much the virus is spreading. 1 million plus cases a day is not endemic. That is a pandemic status, full stop. Like, by definition, if we're breaking 1 million cases a day, we are nowhere near endemic. Endemic means spreading at low levels in a population. So Fauci has, I think, put that line at 10,000 cases a day max. So with that being said, when case counts are under control, then I think we can have the conversation about, okay, have we actually reached an endemic state, or are we going to get a surge in a couple of months when people's immunity is worn off? That's kind of where my mind is at in terms of the future projections of where COVID's at. And if we get another variant, that turns everything I just said upside down.
I've been going across the country for the last, since the pandemic started. I mean, I never stopped driving across country. I've been all over this country. I've probably come close to hitting, 48 states in the past 2 years. And I can tell you, driving around out there, especially recently, there is absolutely a COVID fatigue going on where people are just getting fed up with the mask mandates. They're getting fed up with restrictions. They're getting fed up with everything, all of these things that are being put in place to try and mitigate the spread of COVID. I'm seeing a lot more people talking about how, government isn't going to be able to stop the spread of this. Nothing's going to stop the spread of this, and you're just going to have to live with it and get on with your lives. And so I'm seeing a lot more resistance to things like, a business putting up a sign saying, masks required. There's a statewide mask mandate in the state of Washington and in the state of Oregon. There are a couple of places in Oregon that I've been to where they diligently enforce that. They will ask you to leave. They will not serve you if you don't have a mask on, etc. The other places that I've been to, especially in Washington and a few in Oregon, where that's completely ignored. They have the sign on the door, and almost nobody is wearing a mask inside the store, and nobody is saying anything about it. The employees are, because they're required to by the store. They can get fired if they don't. But none of the customers are, and none of the employees are actually saying anything. It's like, if you could wave a wand and say, this is what we actually have to do to get things to an acceptable level for life to kind of go on normally, I guess. What kinds of policies do you think need to be put in place? And do you think that there's even the will of the general population? Because the the idea that I'm getting from I realize this is all anecdotal, just my personal experience going across the country, but my impression is people just aren't worried about COVID anymore. They just aren't. It doesn't scare them. They aren't worried about it. They think that most of the people who are going to die, the largest numbers of people that are going to die, have already died from it. I'm just seeing a heck of a lot more resistance to COVID policies. What policies do you think should be put in place and maintained in order to get this under control? And what does under control even look like?
Yeah, so I think I could probably give you a decent descriptor of what under control looks like. I would have you look at the countries of Taiwan and Japan. Both of those countries, in the midst of Omicron, are currently sitting at either zero COVID or very low COVID cases in the hundreds. So if you look at what they've done to have such resounding success, they have universal mask mandates. And as you just said, at least in the US, the enforcement of those mandates seems to be inconsistent. But at least here domestically in the US, if you were to have mask mandates, which I am in favor of everywhere in public, you would actually have to probably enforce it, possibly through the police. If people are not complying, you call the cops and they get removed from whatever space they're refusing to comply in. I would also suggest that masks be upgraded to N95, KN95, FFP2/3 or equivalent, basically the highest quality mask that we all should have had at the start of the pandemic, that should have been sent to us by a Trump administration government and also should have been sent to us by a Biden administration government. So that's a systemic failure. Those countries have universal high quality masking. Ventilation needs to absolutely be addressed in all public spaces. I would use Japan as an example of how they've successfully done this. They have CO2 monitors pretty much in every public space to gauge how well the air is being ventilated, considering a lot of spread, in particular with Omicron, is largely through aerosols, right? It tends to be airborne at this point. So in accordance with that information, we actually have to make our public spaces, schools, hospitals, restaurants, bars, everything safer with respect to ventilation. Again, vaccines are a good tool, and I'm absolutely in favor of using them as much as possible. But I think we've kind of fallen into this very myopic track of they're the only tool. We can just continue to hit the booster button and try and get our way out of this. And the more we do that and only that, the worse we're off we're going to be comparatively. So that's kind of what I envision in terms of the policy that's actually going to deliver us out of this, because there are countries who have employed it right now who are sitting at very low COVID in the face of the most transmissible variant yet.
All right, I have a $2 super chat. Thank you, Sinister, for your support as always. We really appreciate it. So thank you so much for your $2 super chat. Homozygote, when did you escape the Matrix?
I don't think I ever left, if I'm being honest. I think I'm plugged into it, man. I'm pretty much hardwired. That's kind of how it goes.
I mean, if you're a proponent of what? Oh crap! I just forgot the name of the theory. Simulation theory. Then we're all in the Matrix, and none of us have left.
I'm a solipsist.
Also a possibility.
I'm a solipsist. I'm the only one in the Matrix, and you all are a figment of my imagination. All right. Well, so thank you very much for your support. So let me piggyback off of what 𝐒𝐤𝐻𝐿 had said. So it sounds like. I mean, it sounds like, okay, so there are these recommendations about quarantines, and it's clear. So 𝐒𝐤𝐻𝐿 is right. What he was talking about was sort of anecdotal, but it seems to me like the CDC's reached the same conclusion he has, because they're watering down the guidelines on the assumption that nobody really wants to follow any of them, and guidelines that are half-assed followed are better than no guidelines at all, or great guidelines that nobody follows at all. So what do you do if you are the head of the CDC? And you have to make a recommendation and try to get people to follow it. What do you say? I may have already heard your answer, Homozygote. I'm not sure, but I definitely want to hear from both of you and see what you got to say.
Go ahead, Ben.
I've already addressed this a little bit at the beginning, but like the whole thing about doctors having to work while sick is absolutely ridiculous. And like, they're already understaffed, so hospitals are so overrun. Like the ICUs are more full than they've ever been, probably even since COVID has been a thing. They're burnt out. Like, if you think the public is burnt out, like this is no joke. Like, the healthcare system, we are taking the burden of all of this. So yeah, the public can feel like they don't need to care, but we still do. We still have to show up. We still have to do everything we were doing, and now we have to do it while we are compromised and while we're sick. Why are we having doctors who are, number one, infectious, two, not functioning up to their capacity, having to take all of this on their own? Why are they being thrown back into the fire on that? It is just causing so many problems. I mean, this is something that like goes into policy that should be made in general. We need more residency spots for physicians. We have enough physicians. We don't have enough residency spots for the newly graduated physicians. So you have a bunch of physicians that could practice but aren't because the government won't fund residency spots. So that's a whole nother issue though. But so I mean, yeah, we're burnt out in society, but like our healthcare system is so broken. And now I think we're seeing it more so than ever, how incredibly broken the system is and how toxic medicine is as well, because you have these old school doctors now who are also saying, well, back in my day, we used to push through, like I would show up to work sick and like I used to work 36-hour days in a row and not care and like everyone's fine. Like, no, that's not fine. That is not fine. We cannot function with as few nurses as we have who aren't even being paid well at the staff level, who are all looking for travel nurse jobs because they're not being fairly paid. Any of the environmental staff at the hospitals are not being fairly paid. No one is like, they're all putting in all this work and the system is just crashing around them. So I know that's kind of a tangent seemingly, but I think this pandemic is revealing a lot of problems just in our system in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've described a lot of the frustrations of many healthcare workers, regardless of whether they have one set of letters after their name or another. I think this has kind of been a big awakening call for medicine and the clinical sector in general, that they are just as proletarianized as any other sector in the American workforce, that when push comes to shove, they will be put in unsafe working conditions and abused to meet the ends of the economy and the powers that be. And I definitely think, the hospital administrators, the government, corporations wanting to replenish their workforce by pressuring and lobbying the CDC for this policy has put all healthcare workers in this abysmal spot where they're being forced to go back to work sick and potentially infect their patients. So I would say, sort of on a higher order, people really view science and medicine in general as this very, noble public service enterprise. But in reality, you're just another abusable sector of the workforce. And that's, I think, what makes this really difficult for healthcare workers, is that they went into this to help people, right? Nobody becomes a doctor because they want to actively make people sick and like that. That's just evil. Like, people go into medicine because they want to serve their communities and the people around them. So sort of on a higher order, to go back to the question, if I'm the head of the CDC, what do I do? I think one of the most immediate solutions that's incredibly supported by science, and it is very simple to implement based on already existing infrastructure, is to make the definition of fully vaxxed 3 vaccines. Scientifically speaking, you get way more antibodies from 3 than you do with 2, and you get more antibodies that are cross-reactive to Omicron and potential other future variants with 3. So that has been supported. Other countries are adopting this. The US, of course, is very far behind. As usual, we're number 1 in being last. So I definitely think that would be the first switch I would flip. I would also, in whatever way possible, whether it's supporting Joe Biden's mandate that's currently tied up in the legal system with respect to vaccines, or suggesting or implementing new ones, I would want vaccine mandates and passports implemented pretty much ubiquitously across every state. I would say mask mandates, and then dedicating a lot of government spending to helping at least very large entities, schools, hospitals, other large places where people congregate in spades, to improve their ventilation. And again, as I think I answered in the last question, spending a lot of money on distributing proper masks in spades to every single American. Under Donald Trump, the Postal Service had a plan to do this, I think, with just cloth. So there is certainly willpower then before Trump himself put the kibosh on that. So if we were already making preparations to do that with cloth, we could easily secure higher quality masks and do the same thing now. I think we would have to probably reckon with the general bipartisan consensus that we like to spend more money on defense and imperialism than we do on healthcare, science, and medicine. So we might have to reallocate some of that money instead of giving the Pentagon even more money than they ask for every single year. I think we've come to this notion that our brainworms have to compel us to spend money only on the military, and we are now dying in spades. We're going to eclipse probably 1 million deaths by March at the rate we're going, and we need to demand that our leaders actually spend money on what is necessary. This pandemic has been a giant wake-up call that, as Ben said, more residency spots, masks, ventilation, vaccine distribution infrastructure. Science and medicine are underfunded. These institutions need more money to do what we need them to do so we all don't get sick and possibly die.
All right, Dr. 𝐍𝐤𝐜𝐴 asked a question, which I had been thinking about anyway, so it's a good question. So thank you, Doctor. I'll ask that question, then I'm going to ask about the new variant they found in France. His question is, Nick, what do your guests think about the idea that virus evolution in general tends to favor high infectivity over high mortality and morbidity? Is that in fact starting to happen?
I would say not necessarily. I mean, I think it's the avirulence hypothesis that, infectious diseases trend towards, making sure that they transmit themselves rather than killing their host. And I would say, at least with respect to COVID, this is not really applicable. I would say when it comes to death, it's a very slow COVID death, right? By the time a person has gotten COVID and reached the point where they're on the deathbed, it's been almost a month, if not more. So long before then, they had plenty of opportunity to transmit. Transmission and death by COVID are two entirely decoupled processes that really do not influence one another in these ways. I will also say, based on a lot of early scientific evidence, Omicron, with respect to its origins, the evidence points towards actually a reverse zoonosis scenario where it potentially came from a mouse. So somebody somewhere happened to infect a mouse with COVID, and then the virus over many, many months evolved and mutated in a population of mice. And then at some point, one of those mice came back into contact with another human, spread it back to us, and then Omicron was off to the races. I can provide some of those data too if Dr. 𝐍𝐤𝐴's interested in actually looking at it. But I would say, the evolutionary history of these viruses, specifically coronaviruses, isn't necessarily one that we can sort of ascribe to this, I would almost call it mythology of tending towards attenuation or transmission, because it does very different things in very different populations, both in humans and in animals. And I don't think it would be really appropriate, both philosophically and scientifically, to sort of try and apply that to COVID. I think this has all been very humbling as far as our notions when it comes to virology, where viruses come from, and how they evolve over time.
All right, Dr. 𝐍𝐤𝐴, I've been on Homozygote's Discord server. It's an amazing place, I have to confess. A lot of it's over my head, so it won't be over yours. So you can sit there, then you can brag, and you can explain it all to me and say, "Oh, but gee, Nick, it's so simple." Thank you, Doctor. But I'll send you a link. I think you may enjoy it, but we'll get to that. All right. So in France, they've detected a new variant. This one is they've dubbed for now 𝐒𝐬, and we don't know all that much about it because it was just recently discovered. Apparently, though, it is believed to be more mutated than Omicron, and there's already speculation, even though I think it's only infected 6 people, that it's going to be more dangerous. So I suspect that's just, well, is that wild speculation? You guys tell me. So what do we know?
I'm sorry, Ben, go ahead.
Oh, we don't know a whole lot.
Thank you all for coming. That's been in time. I appreciate you all, and come check out our Discord, hang out with us after the show.
I'd say in a nutshell, Ben's right. There's really not all that much known, but what we do know is that a lot of the mutations present in this variant it tends to align with a lot of what was present in the alpha variant. It's, as I've seen described, basically the alpha variant with some extra deletions in it. Whether those deletions mean anything in terms of vaccine antibody evasion or clinical severity, that's really largely unknown. I will also say, based on all of the COVID case trackers with respect to variants where they are, don't really say much of anything in terms of how many people are actually getting sick with this new variant. It was largely confined to that particular region of France, and I think in Marseille. So I think all of the genomes or the sequences of the viruses, the clinical isolates for I think like 20 people, I think that's where it stands. There's only 20 of them compared to the hundreds of thousands that have come from Omicron and even more from previous variants. If there was any sign that it was going to outcompete Omicron or Delta, I think we'd be seeing it by now. I will also note that this variant actually predated Omicron in terms of its discovery. So this was a thing before Omicron even really took root around the world. So if it was even going to outcompete Delta, I think it would have probably done so at the very least in that region in France before Omicron came along. So one possibility, theoretically, this is all speculation, that after Omicron sort of burns its way through everything else, that if immunity from Omicron and vaccines is not cross-reactive enough to this new variant, which I would doubt in some cases, that it could sort of displace Delta in a post-Omicron world. That's a technical possibility, but I think that's highly unlikely based on the mutations that it has in comparison to Delta. This is basically sort of a outdated variant with a little bit of extra spice on top.
All right, and then we got a super chat. Yeah, please.
Go ahead.
Well, what I'm going to do,
super chat.
Okay. So I'll hit the super chat. You do your question, then I'll do my final question about the Texas thing, and then we'll call it a night. So I think this is probably aimed at Ben, and we may need. Okay, cool. We may need Ben, not Ben. Sorry, we may need Jake for you to clarify this. I'm going to think of reading it. But $5, Jake 4D. Thank you again for your support, Jake. We really appreciate it. We should not send sick medical personnel to work. However, if they stay at home now, what would happen to the healthcare system without them today? And I'm not sure. Now he's put little asterisks there. I have no doubt he's being facetious, but I'm not entirely sure if I understand the question. So maybe somebody can.
I got it.
Is he just being facetious? Okay, it's all yours.
Well, yeah. The gamble of is taking them out of the workforce more detrimental than having them infect people, and it's way more dangerous to have them infect more people. Like, it sucks that other physicians will have to take over some of the work for another person, but think about if you're exponentially increasing the amount of people that you're going to have to care for, it's better to not have that increase in people you're going to have to care for, and take that physician out of the workforce for a little bit. At least that's my opinion on that.
Yeah, it really, I think, is emblematic of how poorly our healthcare system has fared even before the pandemic, right? I think, as I've heard, I think a lot of other medical students and even physicians describe it, the healthcare system is already kind of in a failing state, and COVID was simply the straw that broke the camel's back and revealed a lot of this was a more profound rot rather than just kind of the superficial, it's kind of hard to go to the doctor sometimes that most people generally experience. So, although that being said, it's a catch-22. I would rather preserve the health of the healthcare workers, the healthcare workforce, so that way they can come back when it's safe and appropriate to care for sick people another day, than continue to eat away at the ranks of the people who comprise our healthcare system, because that one, I think, has the more dire long-term consequences in terms of, even if the strain is incredibly acute today, which it's going to be regardless, after things have tampered down, it's still not going to be pretty. You need to conserve and protect that population of workers as much as humanly possible, because they're all you got, and they're the ones who are highly technically trained and very difficult to replace. So,
but also think about this. Do you want a physician who has brain fog operating on you or making life or death decisions for you? Probably not. You probably don't want that. So it's dangerous for everybody involved to have somebody like that working.
All right, I'm gonna cut off Xander. I do want to get to Xander's question, but and now in contention for the worst state in human history, Florida, who has always come in a very close second to Texas. Florida Surgeon General has declared that a positive COVID test, it's the Surgeon General Dr. Joseph Ladapo.
Ladapo, yeah.
Yes, a positive COVID test proves it demonstrates you have immunity for life. Literally just out Florida Surgeon General. Yay. Go Florida. All right. Yeah. So Xandering, question, yes.
So pulling out your crystal balls, what does 2022 look like going into 2023? You think this is going to be better, worse? What do you think it looks like in a year?
Yeah, I mean, at least for me, it depends on whether or not we get more variants. I think the under-vax state of the world, and not just the United States, but the world as a whole, especially considering some of the early evolutionary data from where Omicron came from, it speaks to there sort of being this, I'm saying this term not to be like very mysterious. I'm trying not to make this sound like an episode of 𝐒𝐬𝐜𝐿, but there's kind of this like shadow realm or like shadow pool of COVID spreading in animal reservoirs that we don't really know anything about, especially when it comes to, Omicron possibly coming from exactly that, an animal reservoir. So I think if we're going to get another variant, it's going to be at a time where it comes again out of left field. I don't think this sort of like variant watching spectator sport is really going to tell us very much of anything when, we get a new variant that pops up in France that might not necessarily be anything, as an example. I think it's going to come at a time where we might be sort of trying to force ourselves back into that normality, back to normal. What we're doing is what we used to do type of scenario. Hopefully at the tail end of an Omicron surge, at the very least where cases are already low, and we might have capacity to address a future variant. So if we get a future variant, which I think is more likely as time goes on if we don't vaccinate the planet, then we might be in for more of the same. But if we don't, and if we actually make modifications to our non-pharmaceutical interventions, read as not just vaccines, but everything else too, then we're going to be in a much better position if that scenario were ever to occur. So if we actually basically try and give a shit, we might actually try and get this under control through 2022 and might be in a better shape for 2023. But if we do nothing like we seem to be doing, I think we might be setting ourselves up for another Omicron type situation where something comes out of left field, if we're unlucky, takes the world by storm again, and invokes that specter that we were talking about earlier of reinfection, and waning immunity, severity, the need for additional vaccines. It'll kind of make the waters even more muddy and cloudy than they are. And I think reduce trust in institutions of science and medicine as a consequence, because people will think, oh, this is supposed to be over by now. What the hell? And it will just kind of give us this positive feedback loop of doom and gloom all throughout the year. So I think if the powers that be try, this is doable. This is very doable. We can do it. Pre-Delta, we were at 7,200 cases a day. This is doable. We just actually have to invest the money and resources to do it.
So I'm very scared for 2023, only because I become a doctor in 2023. So if we mess this up, I'm really scared for what I'm gonna be jumping into in my first year as a doctor. So yeah, I mean, I agree with all that, but that's scary.
Yeah, and Ben, I'll also say too, I guess you could call it a med school reject, right? I think I never got off a wait list at a couple of schools. But if I had gotten into medical school when I wanted to have been, I would have been front lines at the very beginning of COVID. And that is a thought that horrifies me still to this day. So I do not envy you in the slightest. And I do not envy healthcare workers at all right now, because it's incredibly difficult. You're burnt, you're spent. People don't appreciate what you do. So A, thank you. And B, if you're going into 2023 and this is still raging, if there's anything I can do to help, let me know. But good luck, because I have a feeling you might need it.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll get through it.
Yeah. Well, at the flip side, though, the country will need you unlike any time in recent history. And one more reading really.
Oh no!
You know what? This is the crew you bring. This is what comes with you. I love having you on, but every time you come, there's just there's all this riffraff that comes to in time with you, and all of a sudden, Just like,
Gotta keep it
okay.
lively, right? Variety is the spice of life.
Read and rep, $4.99 because he can't do the extra 1 cent. See, this is who he is. This is who we're dealing with. Read rep, thank you very, very much for your super chat. Question for Homozygote: has COVID affected particular populations of young male patients suffering from CCMPS?
This is a meme. I will state first of all, this is Read and Rap's inside joke meme. But I think in accordance with this meme, I can actually spit some real science. COVID can affect the penis and testicles. I was actually getting into Twitter fights about this yesterday when I'm posting literal electron microscope pictures of viral particles in both of those body parts. So yes, it can actually affect any sort of sexual proclivity that anybody may have, at least if you are a young male. So that is all the more reason to protect yourself and get vaccinated. You do not want what is colloquially being called COVID dick or COVID balls. I'm going to say it, but it's a thing. It's a genuine, honest to God, scientifically proven thing.
And it's important to note because I think that there are a number of people south of the Mason-Dixon line, which in this context could mean many things. But at any rate, that may have been poor phrasing on my part. But in some of the southern states, who they're sitting there going like, "My freedom," and I won't give it. It does what? Erectile dysfunction. Well then. So it's worth noting. So that is it's been discovered that there has been at least some correlation between erectile dysfunction and COVID. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a definite long COVID component with erectile dysfunction in young men. That's pretty stark. I will also say it's been correlated that the more severe a case is in a male of any age, the higher the likelihood of extrapulmonary involvement, basically meaning other body systems, including the male reproductive system, everything ranging from viral particles present in the testicles, testicular inflammation, lack of sperm production, deficiencies in other sperm parameters, possible impacts on fertility that are not well understood at this point. So it's even been detected in semen sometimes. So basically any component of the male reproductive tract, regardless of how old you are, can be impacted by a COVID infection. The intimate particulars are still, of course, being sorted out as time goes on, but that should frighten any male of any age that if you want that part of your body to work correctly, you should probably try and not get COVID and get vaccinated.
And we have another super chat, $5 from Jake 4D. Jake, once again, thank you so much for your support. We really appreciate it. Is it at all possible the people who do get vaccinated will eventually become immune, and those that don't shall, we say, no longer be here? And I'll dovetail onto that one. What is the end game? I mean, it kind of looks like from what you had said earlier that maybe we are incapable of permanently developing an immunity to this, and we will constantly get it either like the flu or something like that. That's not exactly his question, so I'd like to see his question answered, but something along those lines. Will people get back? Is there a point where this ends, if or it includes people who refuse to get vaccinated perishing, and those who do end up being okay?
I don't think the vaccine can be used as an absolute in this case because you always will have breakthrough cases. Doesn't matter. Because, I mean, even so, you also have people who are non-responders to the vaccine, and you might not know who you are if you're a non-responder. So there's no way to ever have a vaccine that's 100% effective. And on the flip side, you can have people who are unvaccinated who might have an amazing immune response to an infection and might get as close to immunity as you can get from anything else. And I'm not saying that's a lot of people and it's not reliable, but there's a chance that people who are not vaccinated could have higher levels of immunity. And so it's just a vaccine can't be that absolute.
Yeah, I mean, the strategy has to involve more than just vaccinating. Absolutely. And I think if we actually take those non-pharmaceutical intervention measures, read high quality masking universally, ventilation universally, distancing universally, right? If we still implement these things and if we get case counts under control, then it might just sort of become this, localized, there's an outbreak here, there's an outbreak there. Those areas will take measures to temporarily lock down and then reopen when case counts go down, right? We could get it. We could get the COVID situation to be very highly localized rather than just transmission dial turned up to 11 everywhere in the country. But all of that to say, variants like Omicron are very effective at finding people who are not vaccinated. Again, it's the most transmissible version yet. So considering how transmissible it is, even among vaccinated, boosted people, who of course fare better and transmit less, that much has been proven, it's still technically possible for vaccinated people to transmit. And this goes back to what Ben said. Vaccination is not the only solution. It is part of a broader plan that needs to be implemented everywhere. So the unvaxxed, they might get it. They might have some immunity. They might die upon reinfection. They might die upon the first infection. It's really difficult to prognosticate for any of those people individually speaking. So as far as what the end game might look like, that's why I tend to think we might see this American economy style boom bust where we just get multiple surges a year until everything is really under control, especially if we get more variants. But again, I think somebody in my chat reminded me, we have vulnerable people who are unvaxxed too, not for lack of trying, right? We might have immune compromised people. We have kids under the age of 5 who are ineligible, and they're going to be ineligible for a while because Pfizer's trial actually failed to induce an immune response in kids in those age groups. So it's going to be a while before there are vaccines even available for them in the first place. So that speaks to the greater collective culture and societal need to do things for those people that is not just vaccination.
All right, so last question. And then before I get to the last one, was there anything else you wanted to hit?
No, I think we've been going for an hour and 20 minutes. If you put Splice back in the beginning, so
Yeah.
we could probably go on for another hour with just different questions. But no, it's probably a good time to wrap up.
All right. So last question: there was a vaccine developed in Texas by a small. I think it was a small business there, a small company there. What do you guys know about that?
Go ahead, Ben.
Oh, I know that it is working on being approved for specifically India. So countries that do not currently have access to the vaccine, because if you're thinking about mutations largely coming from people who are unvaccinated, the fact that we've been vaccine hoarding for a lot of this time is not really helping our case. I'll let Homozygote kind of take it from there.
I actually just lost. Oh, the vaccine. Got it. Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. So I think this vaccine was Peter Hotez's vaccine out of Baylor. This is, if anybody has ever heard of Novavax, it's a similar technology. It's simply a recombinant protein vaccine. So it's the quote unquote old school tech. It's not any fancy messenger RNA, this, that, or the other thing. It's simply just like a protein. It's a piece of protein. So they, I think in conjunction with the Serum Institute of India, which is a massive vaccine producer, they've stricken an agreement to produce this vaccine for a lot of the underdeveloped world, the global south, as it were, at a very cheap price. I think they didn't even patent it. So they were primarily interested in vaccinating the world to help bring the pandemic to an end rather than making any money off of it whatsoever. Because Peter Hotez, he's been a vaccine scientist who's been working on coronavirus vaccines actually for many, many years now. And I think society really downplayed a lot of the warnings that he was issuing along with other scientists about the risks of a pandemic like the one we're in now happening in the first place. So it's very heartening, and it's a very good sign to see that actually, coming to fruition, being produced in India in spades. In terms of how effective it is, I think it kind of depends on what variant it's targeted at, but generally speaking, I'd expect it to be, 90 roughly % efficacious in preventing any infection as long as the antibodies last. For any variant it's specifically targeted against, it's very rapid to produce. It can be stored in a refrigerator, so it's very amenable to underdeveloped countries for them to keep on hand to vaccinate their populace. So overall, very, very good thing that happened with that vaccine, and I am looking forward to continued success with that vaccine as it gets implemented in the global south.
Well, very much like the polio vaccine, which of course was not patented, just so that people could, it could be distributed to anybody at the lowest possible cost. This is a non-patented, quote, open source version of the vaccine that is hopefully going to, if it's effective, then there's no reason to think that it isn't going to be, but we don't know yet. But completely available, essentially at cost to anybody who needs it. And it was by the Texas Children's Hospital and director of the advocacy group Public Citizen, Peter Meideruk, said, quote, Texas Children's Hospital's commitment to sharing technology is a challenge to the pharma giants and their false narrative that vaccine production and medical innovation thrive through secrecy and exclusivity. If Texas Children's Hospital can do it, why can't Pfizer and Moderna? So with that, thank you. Oh, were you going to say something, or?
Oh, I mean, I always have opinions about this. I mean, I think it's just corporate greed at the end of the day. Like, the Biden administration was supporting waiving the intellectual property around Pfizer and Moderna's vaccines, but they canceled the World Trade Organization conference where they were going to discuss this because of Omicron. And I think they were kind of looking for a very convenient excuse to, not do that. So I think at that point, that's the only solution, is to seize the property, seize the patents, and make those vaccines as globally equitable as humanly possible. There's no reason why they can't do it. It's just they don't want to.
Well, and I think there's going to be some backlash with the people who helped them get elected, right? Because it's very hard to get elected if you're not getting money from these. You have to get money from somewhere if you're going to get elected in this country. And if it's not going to be big business, that's fine. And then get it from the NRA or get it from somebody else. But there are plenty of people who are willing to give it to you, but you're going to have to get it from somewhere. And if you're getting it from Big Pharma, I mean, realistically speaking, I disagree with the people who say that pharmaceutical companies are all just out. They are at the high end, if you're in the upper echelons, sure, it's a business just like any other, but there are also a lot of scientists there who got into science because they wanted to do science and to help people. But nonetheless, yes, they do need to be able to make money, or else we couldn't have them. But on the flip side, there are times when the money has to be completely irrelevant. And unfortunately, this is just one of them. And that's the antithesis of capitalism, but it is part of what it means to live in a society. So thank you both for joining us. Student Dr. Ben, could you tell us a little bit about where people can find you and what your content is?
Yeah. So I have a YouTube channel called Student Dr. Ben. And that's where I talk about science. I'm currently talking about medicine in folklore. So starting a series on vampires and how that myth started and medical conditions related to that. It'll be a fun time. I also do a live show on that channel called Medical Myths on Saturdays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And then I also have a Twitch channel where I do trivia nights every Friday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And everyone in the audience can play trivia. It's a fun time. So that's where you can find me.
All right.
Medical.
Oh, yeah, yes.
Sorry. On medical practices for vampires. Count me in. I'm there totally.
Yes.
And Homozygote, tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Yeah, so you can find me twitch.tv/homozygote, spelled like the animal, GOAT. My Twitter is the same, just with an underscore at the end. My content, basically, I think it's kind of evolving into general skepticism, the skeptic's handbook to science. And I think a lot of it's been very focused on COVID, because that's very topical right now. But generally, anything in the realm of biology is stuff that I can cover. I have a decent amount of subject matter expertise in a handful of areas underneath that umbrella. I will also say we love to shitpost. We love to meme and have fun. I own the URL accurateshitposting.science, so you can put that in your web browser and find my Twitch stream as well. So we like to have fun while learning some stuff.
All right, and then let's see. If anybody has any comments, please put them in the comment section below. We will get back to them, and we can pass them on to the appropriate people if we need to. We did just get one more super chat. Jake4T, his super chat is usually literally as the credits are rolling. It's, gee, did I miss the show? Jake, $42. If we seize the IP, will they develop a vax the next time? That is, I think, in part the concern.
I can address that real quick. The foundation behind those two vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna, was actually developed by U.S. government scientists. So they really didn't do any research or development. I mean, a non-zero amount, sure, but proportionally speaking, it was very low compared to what the federal government did in the United States to actually develop the protein target that the vaccines are built around. To actually make the mRNA that goes into the vaccine, it takes like an hour to print it on a fancy mRNA printer. So they really didn't have all that much technologically or innovatively standing in their way. They were simply gifted something by the federal government to actually get the vaccines up and running in enough time to actually help people not die. So that's kind of the notion that, we have to protect innovation and research in the pharmaceutical industry. But in reality, we just kind of witnessed how they were gifted something, and they're now being incredibly greedy and selfish and hoarding it, even though it was really not much that they did ever in the first place. As far as the future, well, this is kind of how the pharmaceutical industry is structured under capitalism. They are there to simply make money and not necessarily use the full capacity of their pharmaceutical companies to innovate and develop. We don't have new antibiotics. We haven't had any new antibiotics for a long time, despite growing antibiotic resistance levels. I think it's like since 1970 something, we haven't gotten a new antibiotic yet from the pharmaceutical industry. That's one example of, I think, many areas where the pharmaceutical industry could innovate, but doesn't necessarily do so. That's, if they want to talk more about that, they can come hang out on my stream, because I have a lot more examples and I don't want to take up any more time.
All right. Well, yeah, I think you saw the same thing with NASA too. NASA received government funding, was therefore a open organization. So anything that they developed was actually not couldn't be patented and could be used by anybody. And a lot of companies would take that technology, tweak it just a little bit to suit some brand new needs, and all of a sudden they're making a huge amount of money without ever doing the research and development on it, and getting the benefits as if they had, which is an important distinction. All right. So again, please come join us on the Discord, where we are always following what's going on with COVID and all of the regular news on our Discord. Also, please don't forget to like and share. That really helps us out in the algorithm. And is Andrew, anything else that you wanted to hit before we bail?
There are so many things that I still want to hit, but I mean, it's an hour and a half. I can probably keep going for another hour and a half. So, at some point we're going to have to say, okay, there's going to be future stuff about the virus. We can hit some more things at another time.
We'll have a more relaxed show about a specific topic instead of kind of an update. We have to, because believe me, if he's not hitting you guys on this, he's hitting me on it. It's just like, I'm in the truck, I got 12 hours to kill. So Nick, let's talk. Here's why you're wrong about everything. It's like, what? I just got up, dude. You're hitting me with this heavy stuff. But okay. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. Thank you to my guests, Student Dr. Ben and Homozygote. Thank you, Xandering. Thank you to our mods for doing a great job as always. Thank you for all the super chats, and we look forward to seeing you. Joe and I will be on tomorrow on Overtime discussing all the latest news for the week. Until then, thank you all for joining us, and we will catch you all next time. Have a good night. Welcome to In Time. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. We read all of your comments, and if you like this video, please don't forget to share.